You're listening to the STEMxm podcast, highlighting women in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you today. We are going to have a chat with Corrie Moreau, or Dr. Moreau. She is an evolutionary biologist. Specifically, she specializes in entomology, which is basically the study of insects. Her personal interest is in ants, and she's conducted some super fascinating research in this field that she's going to discuss with us. Corrie is a curator at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and she's also a part of the faculty at the University of Chicago. She has appeared on Brain Scoop, and I'll be sure to include links to that in the show notes. So let's jump right in and hear what Corrie has to share with us about the life of a research biologist. Today I have Dr. Corrie Moreau with us. Corrie, I'm so glad you're here.
Great. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So I want to start with asking you a couple questions about your personal life, and then go into your career. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. So I'm from the South.
And how did your interest in science and biology manifest at a young age?
So for me, I think because I was always attracted to nature and I liked playing outside, but I grew up in pretty urban environments. It meant I spent a lot of time looking at the nature I could find in cities. So whether it was the weeds growing between the cracks in the sidewalk, or whether it was the pigeons or the squirrels, or in most cases it was the insects. And so for me, that was where my passion sort of lie, was finding all these different kinds of animals running around that I could just grab with my hands.
A lot of people have an aversion to insects. Why do you think that you didn't have that type of maybe like disgust factor?
Well, I think that most kids don't have that disgust factor. I think it's something we sort of all acquire through age. And I think because I was encouraged to spend time with nature, it just didn't, I never acquired that fear of insects.
Did your parents encourage you to spend time in nature?
A little. I mean, my mom always watched, all of the nature shows on PBS. And so I think that sort of helped cultivate my love of nature. But, we didn't go camping or spend time outdoors all that much. But we were always sort of told, go outside and play, right? And so what do you do when you're told to go outside and play? You find things to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I read in an interview that you did with someone else that you said, I wouldn't be a scientist if it wasn't for watching documentaries on PBS. So what did you mean by that? What sticks out to you when you think back to that?
I think for me, it was that I saw that studying nature was a real career, and that there was this whole diversity of the kinds of ways you could study nature. And I only learned about that through PBS. So, they show people going on these, safaris and documenting behavior. They would show geneticists studying, some aspect of the evolution or population genetics of fruit flies. I think that was the first opportunity I'd ever had to sort of think about all the myriad of ways that you could, use biology to study the natural world, was through PBS.
So your parents weren't in any type of science-related field, and you were getting your exposure from PBS. How do you think that you were able to get onto the science path as a career instead of just as an interest that you read about? Do you know what I mean?
Sure. So neither of my parents are scientists. In fact, neither of my parents went to college. But my mom always sort of instilled in me that I had to go to college so I didn't have to work as hard as her. That's as much advice she could give me. She didn't really know what you would do with a degree, but she just knew that I needed one. And I didn't really know that I would go on to study science. I mean, I loved science and I loved, math, and I loved all those things when I was a young kid. But you sort of get these societal pressures, and it's nothing overt that I can remember. I just sort of remember it was clear that girls are not supposed to like science and math and bugs and all those things. And so it's not that they ever went away. It's just that I kind of didn't put them at the forefront for quite a long time. And although my grades stayed high in all of those fields, it really wasn't until I was getting ready to go to college that I thought, okay, you know what? There's a few things I'm really passionate about, and biology and science are among them. So I don't know what you can do with a degree necessarily in those fields, but I'm going to pursue that.
Yeah, that's kind of a leap of faith. I can I can identify with what you described, and not not pinpointing a certain thing that happened, but the general sense that girls are not supposed to like this. They don't belong in those areas or whatever. So, how did you end up at San Francisco State?
So when I was getting ready to go away to college, I knew that I wanted to move away. I always had wanted to live in California. And so I thought, all right, I'll just give it a try. And so I had some friends living in Southern California. And so I moved there because since I did not grow up with very much financial resources, I couldn't afford out-of-state fees. So I had to work for a year so I could establish in-state residency within California so I could afford to go to college. And so during that time, I knew I wanted to study entomology and evolution. Those were the two things I really was passionate about. And I was looking around at programs that were available, and San Francisco State was, one of them. And so I thought, well, who wouldn't want to live in San Francisco if I could also study bugs and evolution? So that's how I ended up there.
Okay, so I have to kind of circle back with this. So I grew up in the South as well, or I would consider Texas to be the South. How did you come to know that you wanted to study evolution? Like what year was it that you spent in California before you started college?
So first question, that how did I know I wanted to study evolution? I think I grew up with my mom who believed in evolution. It was never questioned in my home. And so I just sort of thought that, to be honest, I was pretty naive, and it wasn't until probably like the end of junior high that I realized that not everyone believed in evolution. And so for me, I thought it sort of explained the diversity that we saw. I wanted to understand why there were so many different kinds of living forms. And since, evolution is that framework for understanding that diversity, that's the sort of field I wanted to go into. I love getting down in the nitty gritty and looking at just a single species. But for me, where my passion is sort of taking that step back and saying, okay, we might know a lot about one species, but how does that one species fit with everything else? And that's the framework of evolution. And that's why I wanted to study evolution. And then your next question was sort of what was the timeline? So I think I started my undergrad in 1996. So I moved to California in 1994, maybe. So yeah, a long time ago.
Okay, awesome. I feel like that's a bit anomalous to be in that type of household in the South, and lucky in a certain way to have that the science and the evolution already accepted in your home. That's pretty amazing. That's a little bit foreign to me.
Yeah, I think it's because having both sides of my family actually from New Orleans, and my parents were hippies in the 60s and 70s, and I think sort of that framework of just thinking about the way the world came to be wasn't all that foreign to that community.
Right. So you're in undergrad and you've decided to study biology. When you were going through school, did you think about multiple different career paths? Were there different options you explored, knowing that you were going to get this degree in biology? And when did you realize that you could and definitely wanted to become a research scientist?
I think for me, when I first was going away to college and I knew I was going to study biology, you're always, even if you're not thinking about it, your family's asking like, well, what are you going to do with the degree, or a degree in your whatever field you're in. And so for me, the only people I knew with degrees in biology, in real life were my high school teachers. And so I thought, okay, I guess I'll maybe become a high school teacher. That's the only option I knew. So when I started college, I thought, I'm going to get a degree in biology. I'll probably become a high school teacher. But lucky for me, really early on, in fact, it was my first semester of my sophomore year, I was taking an arthropod diversity course, and the professor at the time was looking for volunteers to work in his molecular systematics lab. And so using molecular tools to investigate diversities to study patterns of biodiversity. And so I volunteered immediately and just fell in love with the fact that we could use all of these molecular genetic and DNA technologies to study diversity. I mean, that was brilliant to me. And in fact, I think it was right towards the end of my sophomore year, my first semester of sophomore year. I went in that day to work with the graduate student, and when I arrived, he said, "Today you're not going to work in the lab. The professor you work for, Dr. Greg Spicer, wants to see you in his office." And I thought, oh no, I'm in so much trouble. What did I mess up in the lab? Or maybe I'm not very good at this, even though I'm enjoying it. So I went to his office and I sat down, and he said, "Corrie, you're actually very efficient in the lab. You're doing a great job. So what we want to know right now is, what kind of a career path do you think you're going to go on? If you think you're going to go on to education, we want to make sure that you're learning techniques that you could take into the classroom. If you think you might want to go on into industry, we want to make sure that you're getting access to all the kinds of tools that are available across the department, so you're competitive for jobs in that field. But if you think you want to go on in academia, we want to make sure that you're getting the kind of opportunities that might lead to a scientific publication. So are you going to go to grad school or not?" And this is first semester of sophomore year. My parents didn't even go to college.
Right.
And so I had said to him, "I guess I'm going to grad school." And at that moment, I thought, well, at least I'm going to do a master's. I didn't know what that meant, other than I had made a promise out loud to this person who had invested a lot of time with me. So I was going to at least do a master's degree. And that was actually a moment that fundamentally changed my career path.
Wow, that's amazing that he took that on and provided some leadership there. But wow, what a loaded question.
I know I can look back now and say that, but at the time, you're just like, okay, maybe he does this with every student who's working in his lab.
Okay, so going back to what you mentioned at the beginning, what did you say? Systematics? I didn't quite.
That's right.
Okay, what exactly is that?
So it's essentially the scientific classification of life on Earth. And so the way you can think about it is, how do we know what's related to what? And it could be very closely related species. So if we think about things like primates, right, we might want to understand, how is a bonobo related to a chimpanzee? And then how are those in turn related to humans? And how are those in turn related to gorillas, right? And then how are the great apes related to all the monkeys? But you can keep going further and further back through that tree of life and keep connecting all the branches. So you might ask, how are primates related to other mammals? How are mammals related to other vertebrates? And so on and so forth, all the way through to, bacteria. So there's many ways in which we can infer the relationships of life on Earth. But the one that I use most frequently is related to DNA. So we use either parts of the genome or the entire genome to figure out how species are related to each other.
What type of equipment do you have to use to do this DNA analysis?
The equipment's actually pretty basic for almost any molecular genetics lab. So we use a lot of chemistry, clearly, but we also use just pipettes and thermal cyclers, and so we have DNA sequencing machines. Those are the kinds of technologies that we're using.
Okay, very interesting. So why ants?
Oh, that's a great question. Since I did grow up in the South and bugs are everywhere and ants are really everywhere, I think that part of the reason I got so interested in them is that they were so easy to find. And it wasn't just that they were easy to find, it's that they often seemed like they were doing something, right? When you find just a beetle, you don't know if you're ever going to find another one of those beetles, and you often can't really observe the behavior of them unless they're eating something, right? Or maybe if they're mating. But with ants, you can sort of sit and watch for hours whatever behaviors they're engaged in. So as a kid, I would put out, cookie crumbs like everyone did and watch them carry them back to their nest. I'd watch them wage battles with each other. So I think the fact that if you find one ant, you're going to find many, and you can often observe their behaviors, is really what attracted me to them.
what is mutualism, and how does this play into your interests?
Yeah, so the way you can think about organisms that interact, sometimes they just sort of randomly interact, right? So we could think about people. You pass somebody on the sidewalk, you may never see them again. But sometimes you have these intimate relationships with other organisms. And in the case of many kinds of species, those interactions are sort of fundamental to their own existence. So in the world of symbiosis, there's different kinds of symbiosis, right? So, people often think of parasitism, right? So that's sort of a negative interaction. So if we have a parasite, we know that it usually makes us ill, and that's because the parasite's taking advantage of an interaction with another species and to its own benefit at the cost of the other. And we see that across all of life. But we also know that there's some that are called commensalisms, where we have two organisms that live together, and they can live apart, but they don't necessarily, cause negative or positive interactions. And then lastly, we have symbiosis in the form of mutualisms, where it's beneficial to both organisms. And in some cases, through like obligate symbioses, neither organism can live without the other. And so a lot of what I study are those positive interacting symbioses, mutualisms. So we have two species that must live with each other. Now, we do that with lots of kinds of organisms, mostly with ants, but ants interact with lots of things. They interact with plants, they interact with other ants and other insects, they even interact with bacteria. And so that's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in.
Okay, now tell us, what is biogeography?
Oh, yeah. So biogeography is just sort of trying to understand why a species or multiple species are found where they are on the globe, and what are the processes that led to them being there. So you can think about things like that are isolated on an island, right? You might want to understand, how did they get to that island? How long have they been there? Once they got to that island, did they speciate or did they not? And so that's the kinds of questions that biogeography can address.
Okay, now I'm like imagining you being in school, and how does the path progress to kind of gain all of this information and understanding? Are there actually like specialized classes that are on biogeography and mutualism, and then you kind of put it all together?
Well, I think some schools do have those courses that are that specific. We didn't have those necessarily when I was in school. But I think for me, a lot of it was just sort of, thinking about the biodiversity on the planet and then trying to put that in a framework that has application outside of the one group of organisms that you happen to be studying at the moment. So as much as I can get very excited about studying a single group of ants, what I often want to know is, does this explain patterns that we see in other groups? So are there birds that follow the same patterns? Are there, mushrooms that follow the same patterns? So I want to understand, when we see general patterns, why? So if we're seeing a general pattern in the Amazonian forest, what explains that pattern? Is it when the river sort of formed through the Amazon and divided it in half? Does that explain the pattern? And so then we would expect lots of kinds of organisms to have that same, genetic break or distributional break. But sometimes it might be that you find something quite anomalous, that almost everything follows one pattern, and then you find an exception. So trying to understand why there's an exception is also just as exciting.
Right, absolutely. Tell us, what are you working on right now?
So actually I have a big project going with several collaborators, and we're studying a group of ants called turtle ants. And these are really cool ants that are distributed throughout the neotropical region. So essentially that means from South America through the southern US. And these species are called turtle ants. You should all Google them because they're so beautiful. They have this sort of hardened shell, or a really hard exoskeleton or cuticle. And when disturbed, they usually hunker down and sort of pull their legs close to their body. And they have these little special pockets in their head capsule where they can tuck their antenna in and hide them. So just like a turtle sort of pulls into its shell, that's kind of what turtle ants do as well.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and they're really beautiful. But the reason we're studying them is that we want to understand sort of why there's so many species. So there's about 120 species of these ants, why they're distributed where they are across the neotropical regions, and then how is it that they've been able to diversify, and is it related to their diet and their gut bacteria? So what we're studying is not just the ant host, But in this case, the symbiosis has to do with the bacteria that are living inside their stomachs. So just like we have helpful gut bacteria, so do lots of kinds of organisms, and in fact, many ants do as well. And one of the things that we've been observing is that ants that are herbivorous or vegetarians tend to have the most sort of stable and co-evolved gut bacteria. And so we're studying these within the turtle ants.
Okay, so that leads to another question that I wanted to ask. Where did the idea come from to study ants' gut bacteria, and how do you use that in your research?
Yeah, so the idea actually came out of one of those, fortuitous events where there was a new postdoc who had arrived at the lab when I was a graduate student at Harvard, and he was actually set to work on another group of organisms. But just through a series of events with, trouble with permitting and trying to make sure that he could get his system up and running, he had a bunch of extra time. So he and his previous PhD advisor, Nancy Moran, said, well, we wonder what kind of bacteria there are in insects outside of the groups that they had been studying. And ants are a group that they hadn't studied before, and I had been working on ants for quite some time. So they said, listen, you have hundreds of DNA extractions of these ants in your freezer. We should start screening them for a group of bacteria that we know are found across insects and sometimes can be negative for the host, so a parasitic interaction. And it's a group of bacteria called Wolbachia. And I thought, well, I have my DNA extractions and, I really like Jake Russell a lot. Let's go ahead and screen them. So we started screening them and we found some interesting things, but, ultimately it wasn't all, it wasn't super exciting. It wasn't like I was going to give up all of my research and just focus on that. But in doing so, he started noticing that sometimes when we would use more generalized bacterial primers, so when we were just targeting not just Wolbachia, but, bacteria generally, he was finding some things that were likely associated with the gut. So then we had to go in and be much more fastidious and dissect out guts to demonstrate that bacteria were from these regions. So it was only because he started finding some interesting things in this, just broad scale sampling that we then decided to focus some of our research on the gut bacteria. Now, for me, the reason I find this so exciting is that for a long time there had been this conundrum that ants, the earliest ant lineages are all predatory, and the closest relatives of ants are predators. So we know that the earliest ants were likely predators. Well, there's this paradox that people had noticed that when you go to places that have really dense rainforest canopies, if you survey all of the things living up there, mostly the arthropods, what you find is almost everything is an ant. And so if at that point, although people knew some ants were herbivorous, but the sort of standing hypothesis was that most ants are predators. How do you have so many predators living up there? What are they eating? And so it's only through another technology people started to be able to discern what they were eating without having to actually observe them. And that's by using stable isotopes. So essentially it's a technology or a technique that lets you figure out where do things live on the sort of scale, trophic scale. So whether things are at one end of the spectrum an herbivore or the other end of the spectrum a predator or somewhere in between. And when they did that, they found that most of the ants living up in the canopy were in fact herbivores, meaning that they were not eating other animals. They were actually eating plant-derived resources. So this led to the question, well, if they're all herbivores, then how are they gaining enough nutrition? And that's where sort of the bacterial work came into play. Because now we have a hypothesis that maybe the bacteria are upregulating the host's diet and permitting them to eat this food that's very low on essential amino acids and on many kinds of protein sources.
Okay, very interesting. So can you explain a little bit how you use isotopes in this? How does that?
Yeah. So essentially what you're doing is you're looking at the ratio of heavy to light isotopes and how they're integrated up the food chain. And so, for example, if we were to take 10 different species that are all found in the same habitat, so they start from the same baseline, meaning that the soil and the plants are always the baseline, right? And that you have something that eats a plant, and then you might have something that eats that and something that eats that. And so we know that those isotopes are sequestered as you move up the food chain. So you can measure how much they're sequestered as you move up the food chain, and it tells you something about where they sit on that trophic scale, like who's likely to be eating who and who's eating only plants.
What's the trophic scale?
So the trophic scale is essentially a way of thinking about how species are distributed by diet in an environment. So, if you think about going to the plains of Africa, right? The lowest part of the trophic scale or the food chain is the plant itself. Now, the next thing up might be all of the gazelles that are eating those plants, right? And then you move up another level, it might be something like a predator that's capturing that gazelle. So that's essentially just a way of measuring the food chain or the trophic scale.
Okay. Interesting. All right. So let's see. I want to come back to talking about your work at the Field Museum, but is there anything else that you want to share with us about your research and maybe your love for ants?
I think one of the reasons that I think insects and ants in particular are such great organisms to study is that they're found everywhere in the world, more or less, except on Antarctica. They're easy to study. There's lots and lots of species. There are more species of ants than there are birds and mammals. And you can study them from urban environments all the way through the most pristine rainforests. And so, I would argue that everyone should be studying ants, but at least insects, if not.
That's great. Okay, so I want to back up for a minute. How did you go from your master's degree to your PhD? Because you went from San Francisco to Harvard. How did you make that happen?
So when I was a master's student and I was, doing quite well, my same undergrad advisor was also one of my master's thesis advisors. I had two master's thesis advisors, one at San Francisco State, Greg Spicer, and the other one was at the California Academy of the Sciences, which is a natural history museum in San Francisco, and that was Brian Fisher. And what they brought was sort of complementary expertise because I wanted to study the evolution of ants. Greg Spicer was an expert in evolution. Brian Fisher was an expert in ants. And so I sort of got to unite their strengths to pursue something I wanted to do. But as I was working through it, I realized that I really loved research. And so I started thinking about, where would be the most appropriate place for me to do a PhD? And I had started looking at many different schools, not necessarily in any kind of a serious way yet because it was still early on. And Greg Spicer, my undergrad and master's thesis advisor, said, you should apply to Harvard. And I thought, I'm never going to get into Harvard. What is he talking about? And he's like, they have one of the best ant collections. They have some of the most innovative scientists that are studying evolution and biodiversity. So you should really think about it. And I think that kind of got stuck in my head. And I mean, he was absolutely right that it's got one of the best ant collections in the world. But, I didn't know that I could actually be competitive in a grad program at Harvard or actually almost anywhere, to be honest. And so it was only as I was getting ready to finish up in my last year that I had to start, in earnest applying to grad programs and reaching out to people to see if they might be interested in supervising me. And, I was really, it took a lot of courage, but I did. I reached out to people at Harvard and eventually was accepted there.
How did you decide on your research topics there?
I was really fortunate that, I had two advisors, and both were very supportive of me pursuing what I was passionate about. And they gave me the freedom to sort of, explore what that might look like. Now, with that, they also gave me lots of guidance. And when it wasn't like I was just sort of set free and said, figure it out. I mean, I also had the opportunity to ask lots of questions and for them to say, well, this may or may not be a fruitful line to pursue. So maybe you should think about these other things. And so really all I knew I wanted to study was I wanted to, again, use sort of DNA and genomics to study the evolution of ants, but I didn't really know what that would look like for a PhD. And so I spent a lot of time reading. I was fortunate that in my first year of my PhD, I got to go to the Amazon for the first time and sort of see what diversity looked like there and start collecting specimens or samples for my PhD research.
Okay, and then fast forward to today, it sounds like you kind of have two roles right now. You have this curator role at the Field Museum, and you have a teaching role at the University of Chicago. Can you tell us how you came into these roles, and what does it mean to be a curator at the Field Museum as a scientist?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that people often misunderstand what a museum is in an academic sense. So, although all museums typically have people who are in charge of care of the collections, at a natural history museum, the role of a curator is actually to do scientific research. And so my role is actually not much different than what a university professor does. I have to conduct my own scientific research. I have to write grants in order to fund that research. I have to do education. Now, it may not be in a formal classroom. It might be supervising and mentoring students or working with our exhibits team to help bring some of the science we do down to the public floor. But ultimately, what I'm tasked with is publishing scientific papers. And so I'm essentially using those collections here at the museum to ask scientific questions that I can pursue. Now, coupled with that, I have an appointment at the University of Chicago where not only can I teach, and I do, but I also mentor PhD students. And so that's a really great opportunity to sort of, help the next generation sort of shift into scientific research as well.
Okay, and you mentioned grant writing, and that's something I'd like you to talk about for just a minute, if you don't mind, because that's something that, if you didn't have an academic in your family, maybe you wouldn't know about. But, if you're a researcher and professors who do research at universities and what you do at the Field Museum, you've got to get grant money to conduct the research. So can you talk to us just a little bit about that process, and how did you learn to write successful grants?
Yeah. So I started writing grants as an undergraduate just to help pay for some of the things that the research that I was doing. And so sometimes it might be just to go on a small collecting expedition or maybe buy a small piece of equipment. Oftentimes when you're an undergrad, the grants you can write are to your own department or to your own university. But it's a great experience, that early on to start practicing your grant writing skills. And then I continued that through my graduate program. When I got to be a curator and professor here at the Field Museum, as you stated, it's required in order to fund my research program. I have to be able to bring in money to support that. So I write a lot of grants, mostly to the National Science Foundation and the National Geographic Society. But there are lots of other funding sources available. And really what that is it's an exercise in bringing together what's the preliminary data you have, what is known in the field about the question you're asking, and what's the hole that's open that you're going to be filling. And so that's really what grant writing is about, is sort of, predicting what you're going to find when you pursue the research that you're proposing.
Okay, and you have a lab at the museum, is that right?
That's absolutely right. And so we have a state-of-the-art molecular genetics lab, and we have all of the technology to take things from DNA extraction through sequencing the genomes of things right here at the Field Museum.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know that you've got some programs there that are targeted at younger students who aren't in college yet. Could you talk to us about that?
Sure. So we actually, one of the missions of the Field Museum, outside of, caring for the collections and doing scientific research on them, is also education. And so that comes across in many ways. So the public exhibits are a great way to educate the public. But we also want students to have hands-on experiences doing science right here at the museum. So we have programs from high school upwards. There are even some younger programming, but they don't necessarily work in our DNA labs. But we have high school programming in the form of a DNA residency program where students can come in and work alongside a high school teacher and some scientists in the DNA lab. And we have a Women in Science high school program where a high school student is paired with an undergraduate, and they spend the summer doing scientific research together under the supervision of one of the scientists here at the museum.
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds like a great experience.
I wish I could have done it when I was young.
Yeah, me too. Have you heard of any other programs in the country that are like this? Other museums doing something like this?
In fact, there are lots of programs, and even some universities have these kinds of programs where they give opportunities for kids in high school to go and spend a summer, doing research. And I would highly encourage any kids who are interested in whatever STEM field just to start asking around. Ask your teachers, start looking at many of the major institutions in your city and see if there are any programs available.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So in general, what would you say is the most difficult part of being a researcher?
Wow, that's a tough question. Um, I don't know the answer to that one right now.
Okay, I'll give you an easier one. For
Okay,
you,
okay.
what's the most rewarding thing about your work?
I think it's that moment of discovery when you have that like almost aha moment. It's when you are out in the field, and so maybe you find something you've never found before, or maybe it's when you're analyzing data and you actually see a pattern or you see the results that not only make sense to you, but that no one has ever seen before. And I think to me that's the most exciting part of our work is that we get to make novel scientific discoveries on almost a daily basis.
Awesome. Okay. I want to ask you another difficult question, maybe.
Okay.
Have you ever experienced in academia or in your career sexism suggesting, you didn't belong there because you're a woman or that you were somehow subpar or anything along those lines? And how did you handle it?
Wow. Um, Unfortunately, yes. I think most women experience it in some ways. Uh, and sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's overt. I, and not that either is easier to deal with, to be honest. I mean, the subtle examples are that, you often get told, like, if you offer to do something like, oh, that's so sweet of you. Where if a male colleague offered the same exact thing, that would never be the way it was addressed, right?
Right.
So you sort of get that reinforcement all the time that you're different. And then sometimes it's quite overt, and you hope that you're going to handle it well. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And in my experience, the times I haven't handled it well, it's either because I'm so shocked that I literally can't speak and am embarrassed for the person who's saying the things they're saying. But I typically always try to make sure that if that kind of experience happens and there are other people around, regardless of whether they're male or female, that I point out that that's inappropriate, and maybe not in a very aggressive way, but later I probably would pull that person aside and say, listen, here's why that's not okay. And I hope that you'll change your behaviors in the future.
So, what would you say to young women who are interested in science, but maybe they haven't been getting the encouragement and positive reinforcement that they need?
Keep trying. I mean, ultimately, you want to pursue what you're passionate about because, all those people that aren't supportive, they're going to be long gone by the time that you're pursuing your career. And yes, you're going to encounter new ones, but you're going to encounter that in every field. So why not follow the thing that you love the most and try to make a career of it?
Absolutely. That's great advice. Wow. Okay. We covered a whole lot in a short amount of time. So that covered most of my questions, but is there anything else that you might want to chat about regarding your research or ants or maybe research that you're going to pursue in the future?
Sure. Actually, I'd like to talk a little bit about diversity in science programming. So, people often ask me, like, why do we need women in science groups, or why do we need diversity in science groups, and who should join them? And what I would argue is that everyone should join all diversity in science groups, because one of the things we know is that the only way we're going to overcome these biases is by having everyone engaged in the conversation. So at the Field Museum, we actually started a Women in Science group, and we're over 500 members strong. And more than a third of those are actually men, from our most senior sort of level administrators and scientists all the way through just, people who have joined via the web. We encourage men and women to participate in all of our events. And that's really important to me because I want the younger women seeing that men do support them, that they do want them engaged in science. But also it's important to belong to diversity in STEM groups that you may not be a member of. And I think that it's really critical to do that as well. It's a form of showing that you're a supporter, right? That you're an ally. And so, reaching out and finding those communities and becoming members is critical.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You got it.
I've got one last kind of silly question. So we haven't met in person, but I've seen a couple of pictures on you, and I know you have a couple of tattoos. Do you have any ant tattoos?
I have lots of ant tattoos. Almost all of my tattoos are insects, and so I've chosen to cover myself in the things I love most.
That's awesome. What's your favorite one?
My favorite tattoo or my favorite ant?
Oh, give us both.
I guess my favorite tattoo is of these ants that are in this really intricate pattern that are holding arms and antenna. My favorite ant in the world is a turtle ant. It's the Florida turtle ant, and it's called Cephalotes varians, and it's the most beautiful ant in the world because the workers come in two sizes. They have a small minor worker that does all the jobs of the nest, so they go out and forage for food and care for the young. And the soldier's job, as you can probably guess from their name, is defense. But instead of going out and fighting battles, the way that they serve as defense is essentially by stopping any predator from ever getting access to the nest, because the nest or the colony is the most precious part of the ant society. And the way they do it is they have these giant heads that are flattened dishes. They almost look like they just have a dinner plate on their head. And these ants live inside hollow twigs up in trees, and the holes that are their entrances are exactly the size of the soldier's head. So the soldier just sits there with her head inside the door all day long, blocking any intruder from getting in. And she'll only move out of the way for members of her own nest. And so not only are they bizarre in their behavior, but their anatomy or morphology is beautiful. Again, everyone should Google turtle ants and see pictures of them.
Okay, I will totally put links in the show notes to see pictures of turtle ants and info about them. Okay, so how do these ants that are guarding the doors, how do they know that the ant that wants to come in is in their colony?
Yeah, so most insects and especially ants communicate through not just visual means. And so in the world of ants, a lot of it's through pheromone communication, or essentially through scent. And so when an individual comes to the door and she's standing there, she can use her antenna to essentially almost smell them. And she knows that there's a colony level scent that's unique. And so she knows that that individual is from her nest and not from a different nest and not a different species.
That's so amazing.
Yeah, it's all about chemical communication in the world of ants.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you, Corrie, so much for sharing all this great information with us about your research and your career and getting into science. It's just been a great chat with you. So thank you so much for your time.
It's been my pleasure.
That was Dr. Corrie Moreau, entomologist and biologist extraordinaire. Be sure to check out the show notes for this episode for links to the Moreau Lab at the Chicago Field Museum and links to a couple of episodes of Brain Scoop that Corrie is featured on. You can find the show notes at STEMxm.com/episode 7. And if you're on Twitter, you can follow Corrie. Her handle is just Corrie Moreau. Spelled out, that's CORRIEMOREAU. I did end up checking out an entomology conference that Corrie invited me to, so I definitely expect we'll have more women entomologists coming onto future episodes, so be on the lookout for those in the future. And if you have a moment to help the show out, please head over to STEMxm.com/partner. And there you can find links to our social media for sharing. And this really helps us out because it helps the show get discovered and found by others who can benefit from learning about STEM careers. So thank you again for listening, and I look forward to speaking with you again on the next episode. Bye, guys.
This has been an episode of the STEMxm podcast. Thank you for listening. We would really love if you could pop over to iTunes and give us an honest, positive rating. It helps more listeners find us to learn about STEM careers. Thanks again, cheers, and we'll catch you on the next episode.